take a look at the Mishnah. We're up to the Mishnah on the new parak. Almana lekohen gadol grusha v'chalutza lekohen hedjot. So what we need to understand in going into this new sugya is that we're going to be talking about financial interests that a woman has, that when she brings financial items into the estate of her husband upon marriage. There are two types of assets that a woman can bring into her marriage. In both cases, in both types of assets, the husband has a full controlling stake, but there's one basic difference between the two. One is where we say that is called son barzel, which the term essentially means that it's an inviolate value, so that if she brings in, let's say, $100,000 worth of assets, slaves, furniture, jewelry, clothing, etc., so then the halacha is that this is all marked in the ksuva, the items that she brings into the estate, the value of those items that she brings into the estate, and then upon termination of the marriage, either through death or divorce, a woman has a record of the cash value that she brought into the estate, and she gets that exact cash value back. However, if there's any appreciation or depreciation of those items, the woman does not have to incur that. She doesn't get the appreciation, nor does she have to incur the depreciation. That's called nichsei tzon barzel. There's another kind of asset that she brings in. Usually it's real estate, but it can be sometimes other things as well, like we're going to see in our Mishnah, slaves as well, where the husband does not accept upon himself what's called achrayus, financial responsibility for the fluctuation in value of the item. He has a full controlling stake, but her name is still on the title, so to speak, of that property. And therefore, whether the property appreciates or depreciates, it's really considered a fluctuation in value taking place in her possession or in her name, and therefore upon termination of the marriage, she gets back the property in total, but whatever appreciation or depreciation took place over the course of the marriage, she takes back with her. Okay? So that's the difference between nichsei tzon barzel and what's the other type of asset is called nichsei milug. Nichsei tzon barzel, again, is defined by a specific cash value, and nichsei milug is defined by the item itself, where the woman's name is still on the title of that property, and therefore whatever fluctuation in price takes place for her. So now what our Mishnah is going to do is to compound that issue by talking about a forbidden marriage. Almana lekohen gadol grusha v'chalutza lekohen hedjot. So if you have a widow who marries a Kohen Gadol, or if you have a divorcee who marries a regular Kohen, and hichnisa avdei milug va'avdei tzon barzel. If she brings into the marriage different kinds of slaves, she can either bring in slaves where the value of the slave is specifically marked in the ksuva, in which case the husband assumes full achrayus for that slave's value, and whatever appreciation or depreciation takes place is the husband's responsibility or benefit, or avdei milug, or if she brings in slaves where the value of the slave is not marked, it's really still completely her slave, and the husband can just use the slave, so therefore the fluctuation goes to her. So avdei milug lo yochlu b'truma, avdei tzon barzel yochlu. So understandably, the tzon barzel avodim, because there's more of a control that the husband has over this asset, they are considered to be the husband's slaves, so to speak, and therefore they get to eat truma just like a regular slave that belongs to a kohen. However, if they're avdei milug, if they are slaves that really are still, her name is on the title of the slaves, so then because she's not allowed to eat truma, because she's in a forbidden relationship with her husband, she's become a chalala, she's become profane, and therefore by dint of the fact that she can't eat, her slaves cannot eat as well. The Elohein avdei milug, im mesu mesu la, ve'im hosiru hosiru la. And the definition of avdei milug is that if the slaves die, they die for her, which means that she has to incur the loss. And if they appreciate in value, she benefits from the gain. And even though the husband still has to feed the slaves, he still has to take care of the caretaking of the slaves, but nevertheless, since financially they're more in her camp, so to speak, they don't eat truma. Ve'eluhin abdeit son barzel imesu mesu lo v'imhosiro siru lo hol v'hu chayiv ba'achrayuson hare'elu yochlu b'truma. And the definition of an eved that's its own barzel eved, where the value is marked in the ksuva, and the husband assumes full financial responsibility. Therefore, whatever appreciation or depreciation takes place in that slave, it's the husband's resumes that responsibility or benefit, and therefore, since they're more like the husband's slaves, they get to eat truma.
Is that the achrayas that you mentioned?
That's the word achrayas. Achrayas means the assumption of full financial responsibility.
What happens if they have children, a male, female slave? Do the children also go to her, or do they go to the husband?
Presumably, whatever the status of the parent slave is the status of the child slave. So, but that's a good question. When it comes to avdei milug, do they go to the husband or do they go to the woman? The Mishnah here will not address that case. Maybe we'll see that later on. Bas Yisrael sheniseis lakoin v'ichnisa lo avadim. Now, let's say that's in illicit marriage, but let's say you have a legal marriage, a regular Bas Yisrael, a Yisrael girl who marries a Kohen, and she brings in slaves. Bein avdei milug bein avdei tzon barzel harei elu yochlu b'truma. So the slaves in both cases are allowed to eat truma, because since she's allowed to eat truma, then even if we look at an eved milug as fully her slave, but by rights of the fact that she can eat truma, her slave can eat truma as well. Ubas kohen sheniseis li Yisrael v'ichnisa lo avoda ben avdei milug ben avdei tzon barzel harei elu lo yochlu b'truma. And if a bas kohen marries a Yisrael, so then just like the bas kohen, once she's married, during the course of the marriage, she's not allowed to eat from her father's truma. So too, her avodim that she brought into the marriage with her, it makes no difference whether it's on barzel avodim or nechse milug avodim, they're not allowed to eat truma as well.
It's interesting that the Mishnah starts off with the illicit marriages, and then goes to this is the regular one. You would have thought they would have started with it, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting observation. A lot of times you find that the case that is more of a chidush, that is more novel, is listed first, because it's almost like, I have exciting news to tell you. Let me tell you the weird first, and then I'll tell you the normal. Okay, so va'avde milug lo yochlu b'truma amai lihavi kikinyano shekana kinyan. So the Gemara's first question is, you're telling me that by virtue of the fact that when it's avdei milug, that they belong to her, they don't get to eat truma, but I don't understand. Why isn't this like a Kohen's acquisition's acquisition? In other words, as we're going to see in just a moment, anytime a Kohen acquires a person, and then that person acquires another person, then that second level person is allowed to eat truma. So if I've acquired a wife, because that's called a kinyan, by the way, even though a wife and a slave are two totally different categories of being, but nevertheless, they're both called kinyan. They're both the mechanism of affecting a marriage is the same mechanism of the acquisition of a slave. So if I've acquired a wife, and my wife acquires a slave, then by virtue of the fact that I'm connected in that chain, that should be enough to entitle the slave to eat truma. The Tanya, as the Brisa indicates, Minayin lekohen shenasa isha v'kana avodim sheyochlu b'truma. So the Brisa gives us the simple case. It says, how do you know that if a Kohen marries a woman or acquires a slave, then those individuals can eat truma? Shenamar v'kohen ki yikna nefesh kinyan kaspo hu yochal bo, because the Torah says as a blanket statement, anytime a Kohen makes an acquisition through cash of a person, that person is allowed to eat truma, and that refers both to a wife and to a slave. Uminayin leisha shekamsa avodim va'avadav shekanu avodim sheyochlu b'truma. Now, how do you know that if a Kohen's wife or a Kohen's eved, if either of those parties themselves acquire a slave, how do you know that acquisition is allowed to eat truma as well? And by the way, Rashi points out that normally, whatever a slave acquires, the master acquires de facto. There are, however, exceptions. There are certain situations where if a master explicitly creates a condition whereby certain cash he divests himself from, then the slave can use that independently and purchase his own slave. Okay, but that's a separate issue. So how do you know this? Shenamar v'kohen ki yikna nefesh kinyan kaspo hu yochal bo. As the pasuk says that if a kohen acquires a person of acquisition, then that person shall eat the truma. Now, kinyano shekana kinyan oichel. And what the Brisa says, it's really the same pasuk that we're quoting again. But the Rashi points out that there are two superfluous words, because if the Torah already says v'kohen ki yikna nefesh, if a kohen acquires a soul, then obviously it's kinyan kaspo, then the acquisition is through cash. So what does the Torah mean by adding those extra two words? The way you read the pasuk is v'kohen ki yikna nefesh, ki yikna kinyan kaspo nefesh. You just transpose the words. That if an acquisition of a kohen acquires another person, so then it becomes the acquisition of a kohen, that person shall also eat truma. So the Gemara's question is, why then does our Mishnah say that the almana's slave does not eat truma if she's married to a kohen gadol? Not by virtue of the fact that it's the almana's slave, but by virtue of the fact that the almana is also an acquisition of the kohen, that should entitle her acquisition to eat truma. The Gemara's answer is kol ha'ochel machil, kol she'ein ochel eno machil. Very simple, says the Gemara, because anyone who himself or herself is allowed to eat truma can allow their acquisition to eat truma. But if the owner cannot eat truma, so then her slave cannot eat truma as well. And that's why, because the almana is not allowed to eat truma, because she's become a chalala, her slave cannot eat truma as well. So the Gemara says, "V'lo, oh really? Is that really so? You're telling me that a general rule that if the person himself cannot eat truma, they cannot allow someone else to eat truma? V'harei orel b'chol ha'tameim she'enan ochel u'ma'achilin." What about an uncircumcised kohen? Let's say a kohen suffers from hemophilia, or let's say he's tameh and he's not allowed to eat truma, and yet his slave is allowed to eat truma. So you see that just because I can't eat doesn't mean that my acquisition can't eat. So the Gemara answers, "Hasum pumayu ko'iv luhu." Their mouths hurt them. Now, what does that mean? So what it means is, like Rashi explains, is that's a temporary condition. It's like having a sore in your mouth. The reason they're not eating is not because they're permanently precluded from eating truma. And therefore, even though temporarily they're precluded, their slave is allowed to eat. But here, we're talking about an almana to a kohen gadol where she's permanently precluded from eating truma because she's in a forbidden relationship with the kohen, and therefore her slaves are permanently precluded. Frek the Gemara v'harei mamzer she'ein ochel u'machil. What are you going to say about this case? There's a case called a mamzer where his grandmother is a bas Yisrael, and she's allowed to eat truma because of her grandson, the mamzer, even though a mamzer himself is not allowed to eat truma. Let me just explain the case. You have a woman who marries a kohen, and as long as a woman's married to a kohen, she's allowed to eat truma. Once her husband dies, if she's a bas Yisrael, she's not allowed to eat truma anymore, except if she has a child or a descendant from that kohen. By virtue of the fact that she has a child or grandchild from that kohen, she's allowed to continue eating truma even after her husband dies. Now let's say she has a daughter from the kohen, and that daughter marries a mamzer, and therefore they have a child who's also a mamzer. The halacha is that if her husband dies, everyone dies except her and her grandson, the mamzer. She's allowed to continue eating truma by virtue of the fact that she has a grandson from her husband, her deceased husband, the kohen. Now, in that situation, the mamzer is not allowed to eat truma. Mamzer is not allowed to eat truma. He's a mamzer, and yet he's allowed to cause or allow his grandma to eat truma. So you see, you have an example of where someone who himself is not allowed to eat truma can allow someone else to eat truma. So what do you mean that it doesn't work? Now Rashi asked the question, why do you have to give me the case of a mamzer? Talk about a regular standard case of a Yisrael. Let's say this lady has a daughter and she marries a Yisrael and they have a child who's a Yisrael. And everyone dies except the grandson and grandma. Well, in that case also, the halacha is that the grandma is allowed to eat truma because of her grandson, even though the grandson as a Yisrael is not allowed to eat truma. So Rashi says you could have used the non-mamzer case also, but this happens to be the example that's provided by a Mishnah, and that's why we chose this example. The bottom line is that you see that someone who himself is not allowed to eat truma can allow someone else to eat truma. So the Gemara says, Omer Ravina, Kinyan ochel ka'omar. Kinyan ochel machel, shena ochel eno machel. No. The Bryce is telling you a rule having to do with someone who is acquired by a Kohen. In that case, we talked about mamzer. There's no acquisition. The grandson is not acquired by the Kohen. And that's why that doesn't fit the rule. But the rule is that if someone is acquired by a Kohen, and on the basis of being acquired by a Kohen, that person is allowed to eat truma, then that person's acquisition can eat truma as well. But if that person who's acquired by a Kohen, such as a woman who's an almana to a Kohen Gadol, and she herself is not allowed to eat truma, so then all of her acquisitions are also not allowed to eat truma. So that answers our question as to why an almana to a Kohen Gadol is not allowed to eat truma in our Mishnah. Now we have another answer from Rava. V'Rava Amar midioraisa mechal achli, v'Rabbanan hu degazri behu. Really, says Rava, our Mishnah does not argue with the Brisa. The Brisa says that any time a Kohen's the acquisition of a Kohen is allowed to eat truma, that's really true midioraisa. But here the rabbis in our Mishnah stepped in and they said, by virtue of the fact that this is an almana to a Kohen Gadol, we're not going to allow her slaves to eat truma, even though midioraisa they are. And why is it? Kedei shetomar ani eini ocheles, avodai einan ochlin, zonehi etzlo hilkachasi la'afuka. And the reason is because really this marriage is an illicit marriage. And the rabbis have a responsibility to try and break up the marriage. Right? We don't want these people to stay married. So we want to create a scenario where the woman's going to say to herself, look, I can't eat my husband's truma. Even my servants can't eat my husband's truma. What am I getting out of this? I'm just providing my husband with conjugal privilege, and I'm getting nothing out of it. And this is going to create marital discord, and eventually, hopefully, they'll get divorced as a result. So that's the reason why the Chachamim said that the Avadim can't eat truma, is to create a situation where they'll eventually get divorced. Rav Ashi Omar Gezer Shema Ta'achil La'achar Misa. Rav Ashi says, while I agree that really these Avadim are only rabbinically precluded from eating truma, but it's for a different consideration, not out of a desire to break up the marriage, but rather out of a concern that if we allow her servants to eat truma, then we have to worry that even after her husband dies, this almana's Kohen Gadol husband dies, and she's now reverting back to just not being allowed to eat truma, we have to be worried that she'll continue feeding her servants truma even after her husband dies. And therefore we say to her, don't feed them truma at all, even when your husband is still alive.
Where's she going to get the truma? Yeah.
She'll go to the estate. She's still living in the house. There's stuff in the cupboard. So the Gemara says, Ela me'ata, bas Yisrael sheniseis lakoin lo sachil, gezer shemetachil la'achar misa. So the Gemara says, and why do you have to talk only about an illicit relationship? Mm-hmm. Even in a legal relationship, if she's a Bas Yisrael and she's married to a Kohen, then if her husband dies, we should tell her, you're never allowed to eat truma, and you can never feed your avadim truma, lest you come to feed them truma after your husband dies. And we certainly don't have that concern. So, Ela Amar Ravashi, Ba'almana Kohenes Da'asti La'oruye, Me'ikara Achli Bitruma, Devei Nasha, Imsabi Lahai, Achli Bitruma Degavra, the concern is only about an almana marrying a Kohen Gadol, where the almana herself is a Bas Kohen. The almana herself comes from a Kohanic family. And therefore she's going to argue to herself like this, look, before I got married, my servants ate from my father's house. After I got married, my servants ate from my husband's house. So now that my husband is dead, they'll continue eating truma. I'll just go back to my father's house and they can continue eating truma. This has been the status quo for years, both before and after I got married. However, v'lo yada'a demi-ikara lo shivisa l'nafsha chalala, hashta shivisa l'nafsha chalala. But what she's going to fail to realize is that she can't feed the avadim truma now because she can't go back to her father's house. In other words, really midioraisa, these avadim, because she's married to the Kohen, these avadim are allowed to partake of truma because they're the acquisition of his acquisition. But we're going to forbid that because if after he dies, she's going to think that they can continue eating truma in her father's house, that's not true anymore. Once a woman enters into an illicit marriage with a Kohen Gadol because she's an almana, then she's never allowed to go back to her father's house to consume truma. And therefore, since she's not allowed to consume truma, her servants will not be allowed to consume truma either. And in order to avoid that confusion that she may potentially have, we forbid any almana bas kohen from feeding her servants truma even while her husband is still alive.
The fact that she can't eat, that she'll know, oh, I can't eat, my servants can't eat.
Well, she can't eat in the course of the marriage anyway.
No,
the point is,
she goes back to her father's house.
No, because her argument is going to be, my servants ate when I couldn't eat truma, so let them. I'm going back to my father's house. They ate truma before I left. They'll eat truma now when I come back home, and that's the confusion.
Can she eat truma? Is this illicit marriage with a Kohen Gadol?
She's not allowed to eat truma.
Of her husband?
No, she can't eat. Even when he's alive, she can't eat. And that's what the Gemara had originally said. The reason why the Avodim can't eat is because she can't eat. But the Gemara is saying a different answer. The Gemara is saying from the Brisa, it implies that even if she can't eat, as long as the slaves are an acquisition of his acquisition, they should be allowed to eat. And we're saying, therefore, yes, it's true, but that's only biblically, but rabbinically, they can't because of this confusion that's going to be created. So the Gemara now says, Teinach almana kohenes, almana bas Yisrael ma'ikal meimar. So the Gemara says, but that's only true that we should have this concern where the almana is a bas kohen. But what if the almana who married the Kohen Gadol is a bas Yisrael? So then why should there be any confusion? She'll let her servants eat while her husband is alive. Once the husband dies, she'll know that she's a bas Yisrael. She can't go back to it. There's no father's house that she can go back to feed her avodim truma. So the Gemara answer is ba'almanusa lo pligi rabbanan. The Gemara says that the Chachamim made an across-the-board decree. Anyone who has this stigma of being an almana to a Kohen Gadol, because of the concern that in situations where she's a bas Kohen, there's going to be confusion. So across the board, all situations like that, even when she's a bas Yisrael, her servants cannot eat truma.
The bas Kohen almana, she can't eat truma while her husband's alive, as we said. Sorry, and did you say that her avodim can?
Biblically, they can, and the Mishnah says that they're not allowed to. So the Gemara is explaining that biblically they can, but this is a gezerah derabanan to prevent the confusion that we've just described. That when her husband dies, she may think that they're allowed to continue eating from her father's house. Okay?
That's a very odd situation. She can't. She's sitting in this household. Her slaves are eating truma from her husband, and she's sitting there eating.
Correct. She's not. Well, she understands. Slaves didn't do anything wrong. I'm the one that's in an illicit marriage. Okay. So Itmar, hamachnese shom labayla hi omeres kelai anino teles v'hu omer domim aninosim. Let's go back to the law of nichsei tzom barzel as a general rule. Let's say a woman brings in a very expensive bookcase into the marriage, a very expensive furniture. We'll call it a bookcase. They get divorced, and the bookcase is worth $1,000. She says, "I want the bookcase," and the husband says, "No, I'm writing you a check for $1,000." I mean, after all, I took financial responsibility, so for all intents and purposes, the bookcase is mine. So here, I'll give you $1,000. I like the bookcase. I got all my svarim on it, right? So the Gemara says hadinim mi. So who is right in that dispute in the divorce court? Who gets the bookcase? So Rav Yehuda Amar hadin ima. The Rabbi Ami Amar hadin imo. Machlokas between Rav Yehuda and Rabbi Ami. Rav Yehuda says she gets the bookcase, and Rabbi Ami says no, he gets the bookcase. Rav Yehuda Amar hadin ima. Mishum Shevach Beis Aviha Didahavi. And Rav Yehuda's argument why she gets the bookcase is because this is a family heirloom from her parents' home, and therefore there's a sentimental connection that she has to it that is more compelling than the husband's financial interest. I mean, for him, it's no difference whether it's $1,000 or a bookcase. Let him go out and buy another bookcase worth $1,000. But for her, this is something that comes from her family, so she's entitled to keep it. And Rabbi Ami Omer Hadinimo, Kevin to Omer Mar im Mesu Mesulo Bimosiro Sirulo, Hol V'chayv Ba'achrayusan Ye'ochlu, or Yochlu. He says like this, Rabbi Ami says, listen, looking at it purely from a financial arrangement, the husband had accepted all financial responsibility for this bookcase, and therefore, for all intents and purposes, it's his. And therefore, he's allowed to control whether or not he keeps the bookcase or whether he keeps the value of the bookcase. So, Amar of Safra, Mi katani vehein shalo, hol v'chayiv b'achriyusin katani ula olam lavdi de ninhu. So Rav Safra challenges Rabbi Ami. He says, wait a minute, it doesn't say in the Mishnah that the assets or the slaves, whatever Nichsei Tzon Barzel that she brings in, actually halachically is his possession. It just says that he assumes financial responsibility. So that implies that they're not his. So how can you, Rabbi Ami, say that he gets to keep the bookcase? So the Gemara says, V'chol heicha dechai b'achor yusan achli b'truma. So 1 second, says the Gemara, you mean that just because, you mean if they're not his, but he assumes financial responsibility, that's enough for the slaves to eat truma? That doesn't seem to be the case, because v'hatznan, Yisrael shesochar para mikohen, hareze ya'achilena karshinei truma. Here, let's say you have a guy who rents a cow. We have rent-a-cars, and back in those days they had a rent-a-cow. So Yisrael rents a cow from a kohen, and the Yisrael takes responsibilities for the cow as a renter. That's one of the socher, is what we learn in Bava Metzia. He has certain responsibilities of assumption of liability, right? And even though he's assumed liability for this cow, nevertheless the cow is still considered to be the kohen's cow, who's the owner, and therefore the cow can eat feed that's from truma. But kohen shesachar param Yisrael, afal pishim izanoseha alav lo yachil ena karshine truma. But if a kohen rents a cow from Yisrael, even though over the course of the rental the kohen has to feed the cow, but the kohen may not feed the cow the truma feed from his house, because it still belongs to the Yisrael. So you see that just assumption of liability is not enough to make it like it's yours, to be able to feed the cow truma. So why are you suggesting that these slaves, because the kohen assumes financial liability, that that's enough to allow him to feed them truma? You see, not the way from our Mishnah. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, v'tispira, what kind of analogy are you making? Nihi nami demechayv b'gneva va'aveda ba'onsei b'kachasha u'v'nivchas dameha mi mechayev. But 1 second, you're not, Gary, creating an apt analogy. In the case of a renter, there's limited liability. What do we mean by limited liability? When you rent a cow, are you liable for all mishaps, for all appreciation and depreciation? No. You're only liable if the animal gets stolen or lost. But if the animal gets hit by lightning, or if the animal depreciates in value, that's not the responsibility, that's not the liability of the renter. And that's the reason why the renter is not considered to be the owner of the cow. But in our case, where the husband assumes full liability, not limited, but full liability, that's why he's allowed to feed them truma. He says, Halo damya elo l'seifa. And therefore, take a look at the seifa, the second part of that Mishnah that you're quoting from Bava Metzia, which says, where is it? It's actually not in Bava Metzia. It's in Avodah Zarah, or Maseches Trumos. But anyway, the point is the same. He says, Yisrael shesham para mikohen lo yachilena karshine truma, aval kohen shesham para miYisrael yachilena karshine truma. That what if not just a renter who takes limited liability, but if a Yisrael rents a cow from a kohen and takes full liability to the point where they put the cash value of the cow in the contract, in the lease contract, and the renter says that whatever value is put in the contract, I have a responsibility to return to you. So even if the cow depreciates in my possession, I will make good on the value of the cow. So in that situation, the renter, who's a Yisrael, is not allowed to feed it truma feed. But if a kohen rents from a Yisrael in that context, so then he is allowed to feed it, even though he's still just renting a cow. But nevertheless, since he's assumed full financial liability, he's allowed to feed it truma. And therefore, not only is there not a kasha from this Mishnah, but it's actually a support to what Rav Yehuda is saying, that really the bookcase does not belong to the husband. But because the husband has assumed full financial responsibility, the bookcase, or the slaves in the case of our Mishnah, are allowed to eat truma. Okay, so Yosef Rabbah.
The whole idea of giving back the bookcase, or getting the bookcase back, what happened if it increased in value? How can she get it back? We said that.
We're going to see. She would have to pay the difference.
Oh, okay.
She'd have to pay the difference,
Right.
but at least she's
Right.
entitled to demand
Uh-huh.
the original bookcase. So Yosef Rabbah v'Rav Yosef b'Shilei Pirkei de Rav Nachman v'Yosef v'Ka'amri Tanya Kavase de Rav Yehuda v'Tanya Kavase de Rabbi Ami. So these two sages, Rabbi and Rav Yosef, were sitting together after the shir that Rav Nachman had just given, and they said, you know what? We have a brisa to support Rav Yehuda, who says that she gets the bookcase, and we have a brisa to support Rabbi Ami, who says that he gets the bookcase. Tanya Kavose de Rabbi Ami. Let's look at Rabbi Ami first. It says, Abdeit son barzel yotzen b'shein v'ayin le'ish, avolo le'isha. Now let's review our law in the Torah. The Torah says that if I own a slave and I knock out the slave's eye or the slave's tooth, it doesn't matter whether it's deliberate or by accident, the halacha is the slave automatically goes free. But that's only true if the owner does it. If someone who doesn't own the slave does it, then the slave is still a slave. So what you see from here is that if the husband takes an eved son barzel of his wife, and the husband accidentally knocks out the slave's tooth, then the slave goes free. What does that tell you? It tells you that it's considered to be his slave. Not just that he has financial liability, but it's his slave mamish. And by contrast, if the wife knocks out the tooth, then she doesn't assume, then the slave does not go free. So it seems like it's not her slave anymore. So that supports Rabbi Ami's contention that he gets the bookcase. But on the other hand, Tanya Kavose de Rav Yehuda, Hamachnes shom lobayla im rotza habal limkor lo yimkor v'lo od el afilu habane hichnes la shom mishalo im rotza habal limkor lo yimkor. That the brisa here is totally different. It says that if a woman brings nichseit son barzel into the marriage, so they put the value into the ksuva, the husband does not have rights to sell it. And not only that, but even in a situation where the husband brings the assets into the marriage, and they record the assets of the husband so that there'll be a record in case the marriage terminates, but this is like shared communal property, right, during the course of the marriage. So the husband brings in certain furniture and the wife brings in certain furniture, but since he's listed it as something that they share during the marriage, so then neither of them is allowed to sell any of the furniture during the course of the marriage. So Machu Shneim Leparnasa, Zehaya Maisa Lifnei Rabbi Neshama and Gamliel. So what if one of the two decides to take one of these community property furniture items and sells it during the marriage? So what's the halacha? So this one once came up before Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. Ba'omar Habal Motzi Miyad Halukuchos. That he says, let's say a woman brought in a bookcase into the marriage, and then she died. But before she died, she sold the bookcase. So the halacha is the husband has a right to demand it from the owners, from the purchasers of the bookcase, and he'll pay them cash. However, from the first part, what you see is that the husband has no right to sell it. The husband has no right to sell it, even though it's nichseit son barzel. While they're married, the husband can't sell it. So what you see from here is that it's not considered to be his property. If it was his property, he'd be allowed to sell it. So that proves more like Rav Yehuda, that it's really not his bookcase. So Amar Rava, Amar Rav Nachman, halacha ka Rav Yehuda. So Rava says in the name of Rav Nachman that the halacha is taka like Rav Yehuda, that she gets the bookcase. Amar le Rava le Rav Nachman v'hatanya kavase de Rabbi Ami. But what about the brisa that we just quoted about the Eved whose tooth gets knocked out, that it seems like it's his slave completely? There's a brisa that supports Rabbi Ami. So Afal Gav the Tanya Kavase, the Rabbi Ami Mistavra time of the Rav Yehuda Mishum Shevach Beis Aviha. I will grant you there is a brisa that is more indicative to Rabbi Ami, but logic and rationale is on the side of Rav Yehuda. And what was the argument? Shevach Beis Aviha. This came from her home. This came from her parents' home. There's a sentimentality of it being part of her ancestral possessions, and therefore it should go by all rights. It should go back to her parents' house. So hahi itza da ailale legavre itza la demilsa biksuvasa shachiv shaklua yasmiu parsuha amesana. Gemara now illustrates the following story. There was once a case where a woman had brought in as nichseit son barzel a very expensive silk scarf or shawl. Her husband passes away, and so you would expect, if we paskin like Rav Yehuda, that she should be able to take back the scarf, and that's the end of the story, right? But no, the children of the decedent, they may not have been his wife's children, but they were his children. They go ahead before she has a chance to get the scarf, and they take it and they wrap it around the casket. So Amar Rava Kanya Mesana. So Rava now says it belongs to the dead, belongs to the decedent, and once something is made for the burial, it's now asur bahana. You can't benefit from it anymore. It's like the tachrichin, the shrouds of the dead. where no one's allowed to benefit from it, and as a result, you've lost your shawl, lady. Sorry. So now, obviously, is she entitled to get compensated for it? Yes, 100%. It would seem that way, but she lost her shawl. So Amar le na'anoi berei de Rav Yoseph berei de Rav Rav Kahana v'ha'amar Rava Amar Rav Nachman halacha ka Rav Yehuda. But why doesn't she get her shawl? Isn't the halacha like Rav Yehuda that as soon as she's really the bookcase belongs to her, the shawl belongs to her? So what right do they have to do that? So Amar le mila moda Rav Yehuda de mechusar guvaina v'keva de mechusar guvaina birushu seikoi. Yes, that's true that she's allowed to take it, but she hasn't. As long as she hasn't collected it yet, it's still in the husband's possession or in his estate's possession, and therefore they have a right to block her from getting it by using a certain kind of mechanism to permanently preclude someone from being able to use that which is really theirs. And Rava L'taime, Rava is, according to his reasoning, the Amar Rava, hekdesh chametz v'shichrur mafkiyan midei shibud. And we've seen this, so it's just a few weeks ago. Rava had said that even though a person may have a lien on a property, because let's say he's a creditor and there was a piece of property that was identified as collateral for the loan, it is possible for the debtor to play a trick on the creditor and to break that lien. He can do it in one of three ways. One way he can do it is by declaring the property to be hektish. And therefore that breaks the lien, because now that it's hektish, even though I'm a creditor, I have no more rights to it. The second way to do it is if, let's say, a debtor identified his slave as collateral on the debt. In that situation, if the debtor frees the slave, sorry, your collateral's gone. And the third way that the debtor can do this is, let's say he took a loan from a goy, and the goy wanted collateral, and the Jew has a warehouse full of expensive scotch, and he says that's going to be the collateral on the loan. And then when Pesach comes and you're not allowed to benefit anymore, you have to divest yourself, and by making it hefker, and it automatically becomes hefker. So then that also breaks the shiva, that breaks the collateral lien on the scotch, and therefore the goy can't take it now as possession, because since it's not the Yisrael's anymore, the goy can no longer take it. But the bottom line is that what you see from here is that even if a person like a creditor actually has an acquisition of sorts on a property, but since it's not in his possession right now, it's just that there's a legal claim that he has on it. If there is a way he could lose it. There's still a way to break that legal connection from him if you do something that's going to create it now asur bahana. So therefore, this is also the same way. By placing the silk shawl over the casket, you've made it now asur bahana, and therefore the woman can't use it anymore, even though it's technically hers, but she hasn't collected it yet, and therefore therefore the Yisomim still can control its use, and therefore block her from ever using it again. Amar Rav Yehuda hichnisa lo shnei kelim be'elev zuz v'shavchu v'amdu al shnei alafim. So this goes back to Mark's case. Mark just asked this question: what if a woman brought in two pieces of furniture? She brought in a bookcase and a candelabrum, let's say. The bookcase was worth 500 and the candelabrum was worth 500 when she brought it into the marriage. And now at the divorce, each one independently is worth 1,000. They've both doubled in value. So the question is, so how do you deal with it? Now we hold that she's allowed to get her family heirlooms back, right? So she's entitled to get both the bookcase and the candelabrum. But what about the fact that they've appreciated in value? So echad notlaso biksuvasa, ve'echad nosenes damim v'notlaso mipnei shevach beis aviha. So the halacha is she can take the bookcase, which is worth the original $1,000 of both items, and that's for the compensation for her ksuva, because that was written, $1,000 was written in her ksuva. And if she wants the candelabrum, she's got to pay an extra $1,000 from her own bank account in order to get the candelabrum back. Okay? Now, and the reason is because, and the reason why she can demand that is because it's a family heirloom. So the Gemara says, "Mai kamashbel an shevach beis aviha dida haviha amar Rav Yehuda chada zimna." So what's the chiddush of that statement, Rav Yehuda? You're telling me that because of family heirloom sentimentality, she's entitled to get her original items back? You already taught me that. You taught me that shevach beis aviha entitles her to the heirlooms. So the Gemara says, no. Mahudu tema hani mili hecha demachul mishkal biksuvasa. The chiddush of Rav Yehuda is that you might have thought that that's only true when she's entitled to the cash value of the heirloom in her ksuva. But let's say she's already collected the $1,000 of value that was written in her ksuva for the nichsei tzon barzel that she brought into the marriage by just taking back the bookcase. You might have thought game over for her, and the husband can argue, I want to keep the candelabrum for myself because you've already collected what you're entitled to of your family heirlooms from the ksuva. So the chiddush now is that even though she's already fully gotten what was committed to her in the ksuva from the nichsei tzon barzel in the family heirloom, she's entitled to the second family heirloom by actually paying for it beyond the ksuva. That's the chiddush, is that she can demand that even though I've already gotten the value of the ksuva back, but I have another family heirloom that I want, and as long as I pay for it, you have to surrender it to me. Have a wonderful day.